The immigrant shared a meal with a beggar, stunned when the beggar later saved his business. But Alejandro Fuentes hadn't known any of this was possible when he'd first arrived in America with nothing but $20 and his grandmother's recipes folded in his pocket. The sharp November wind cut through his thin jacket as he huddled in the doorway of his small restaurant. Abuela's Kitchen, 3 months open, 3 months of dwindling savings, and 3 months of customers too scarce to mention. His fingers, chapped and red from washing dishes in scalding water, trembled as he turned the key in the lock. The metal felt ice cold against his skin, almost as cold as the fear solidifying in his stomach. Final notice. Read the paper he'd crumpled and smoothed out a dozen times today. The electricity would be cut off tomorrow if he couldn't make the payment. Without power, there would be no restaurant. Without the restaurant, there would be no visa renewal. Without the visa, Alejandro's throat tightened. He couldn't go back to Venezuela. Not now. Not when everything had collapsed there. Not when he had promised his dying grandmother he would make something of himself with the recipes she had whispered to him through cracked lips during her final days. Inside, the restaurant was quiet, too quiet. The cheerful yellow walls his cousin Miguel had helped him paint seemed to mock him now. 6 tables, each with 4 chairs, 24 seats that remained empty most days. The gleaming kitchen with equipment he'd bought secondhand, but maintained with obsessive care. Everything spotless, everything ready, for customers who never came. Alejandro moved behind the counter, his body on autopilot as he began preparing ingredients for tomorrow. There might not be many orders, but he would be ready nonetheless. Dignity, his grandmother had taught him, persisted even when hope faltered. The knife moved rhythmically against the cutting board as he diced onions, the familiar motion soothing his frayed nerves. The sharp scent stung his eyes, providing a convenient excuse for the moisture gathering there. He wasn't crying. He wasn't beaten. Not yet. A soft tapping at the front door startled him from his thoughts. Through the glass, a figure stood hunched against the wind. Alejandro squinted, making out a man with a weathered face and a beard streaked with gray. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and he carried nothing but a small backpack that had seen better days. Alejandro hesitated. He'd been warned about the homeless population in this area when he'd signed the lease. The landlord's words echoing in his memory. Don't encourage them. Bad for business. The man's eyes met his through the glass, and something in them, a quiet dignity despite obvious desperation, made Alejandro's hand move to the lock. We're closed, he said, opening the door just enough to speak. We open tomorrow at 11. The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of impending snow. I'm not looking to buy, the man said, his voice surprisingly clear and articulate. Just wondering if you might have any leftover food you'd otherwise throw away. Haven't eaten since yesterday. Alejandro's grandmother's voice whispered in his memory. A meal shared is never a meal wasted. She had fed neighbors during the worst of Venezuela's economic collapse, even when their own pantry grew bare. He opened the door wider. Yeah, come in. It's too cold to talk outside. The man stepped in, bringing with him the smell of the streets, but he kept a respectful distance, conscious of his condition. He stood just inside the door, not presuming to sit down. I'm Jack, he said simply, extending no hand, asking for no more than he'd already requested. Alejandro, he gestured to a table. Sit. I was preparing for tomorrow anyway. I can make something fresh. Jack's eyebrows rose slightly. You don't have to do that. Alejandro shrugged, already moving back to his kitchen. My grandmother believed no one should go hungry if you have the means to feed them. He didn't mention that his means were rapidly dwindling. As he cooked, he felt Jack watching him from the table. Not with the impatience of hunger, but with a curious attention to Alejandro's movements, the way he handled the ingredients. Venezuelan food? Jack asked after a while. Alejandro nodded, surprised. Most Americans just called it Spanish food, or Mexican, ignorant of the differences. I recognize the arepas, Jack said, gesturing to the cornmeal dough Alejandro was shaping. Had a Venezuelan roommate in college lifetime ago. The statement hung in the air, raising questions Alejandro didn't feel entitled to ask. How did someone go from college to asking for scraps on a cold November night? These are my grandmother's recipe, Alejandro said instead, sliding the arepas onto the griddle where they sizzled pleasantly. She used to say food carries memories. When you eat something made with love, you're consuming more than just ingredients. Jack's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Smart woman. She was, the past tense caught in Alejandro's throat. When the meal was ready, arepa stuffed with slow-cooked shredded beef, black beans, fried plantains on the side, Alejandro brought 2 plates to the table. Jack's eyes widened. "You're joining me?" Alejandro sat down. "A meal shared is never a meal wasted," he repeated aloud this time. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jack ate methodically, savoring each bite with closed eyes. Alejandro found himself watching the man's reaction more than focusing on his own food. "This," Jack said eventually, gesturing to his nearly empty plate, "is exceptional. Your grandmother taught you well." Pride warmed Alejandro's chest, momentarily displacing the cold fear that had taken residence there. "Thank you." When they finished, Jack helped clear the plates, taking them to the sink before Alejandro could object. "Let me wash these. Small repayment. Not necessary." "Please." Something in Jack's tone, a need to contribute, to not simply take, made Alejandro nod. As Jack washed and Alejandro dried, the older man glanced around the empty restaurant. "Not busy?" Alejandro's shoulders tensed. "New business. Takes time." Jack nodded, saying nothing more, but his eyes lingered on the final notice still visible on the counter. When Jack had finished washing up, he pulled a small notebook from his pocket, tore out a page and wrote something down. "Thank you for the meal, Alejandro. Best I've had in years." He handed over the paper. "If you ever need anything..." "Well, I don't have much to offer, but I'm around." Alejandro took the paper, noting a phone number scrawled in neat handwriting. Jack had added beneath it, "Jack Mercer, Grateful Diner." "How will I reach you?" Alejandro asked, looking at the number. Jack patted his backpack. "Old flip phone. I keep it charged at the shelter. For emergencies and job interviews when they come." After Jack left, Alejandro stood in his empty restaurant, the silence heavier than before. He tucked Jack's number into his wallet, an automatic gesture more than an intention to use it. That night, lying awake on the small cot he'd set up in the restaurant's back room to save on rent, Alejandro tried not to think about tomorrow, about the electricity being cut off, about the domino effect that would follow, cascading into deportation. Instead, he thought about Jack, a man who clearly had nothing, yet carried himself with a strange dignity, who appreciated good food, who had once had a Venezuelan roommate and remembered arepas, who washed dishes with the practiced movements of someone used to working in a kitchen. The next morning dawned gray and threatening snow. Alejandro rose early, his body stiff from the uncomfortable cot and poor sleep. He went through his opening routine mechanically, checking inventory, prepping ingredients, wiping down tables that had not been used. At 10:30, half an hour before opening, there was a knock at the door. Alejandro looked up, expecting to see Jack again. Instead, a tall woman in an expensive-looking coat stood outside, her breath fogging in the cold air. Alejandro opened the door, confusion evident on his face. "Are you Alejandro Fuentes?" she asked, her voice brisk but not unfriendly. "Yes, I'm Claire Barton." She extended a gloved hand, which Alejandro shook automatically. "Jack Mercer suggested I try your restaurant. He was quite insistent, actually." "May I come in?" Alejandro stepped aside, his mind racing. Jack had sent someone? Already? "We don't officially open until 11, but..." "That's perfect," Claire interrupted, unwinding a cashmere scarf from her neck. "I'd like to discuss something with you before you get busy." Alejandro bit back a bitter laugh. Busy was not a word that applied to Abuela's kitchen. Claire settled at a table, removing her gloves with practiced efficiency. "I run the food blog Boston Bites. Perhaps you've heard of it?" He hadn't, but he nodded anyway, not wanting to appear ignorant. "Jack contacted me this morning with a rather passionate pitch about your food. He described your arepas in such detail, I practically tasted them through the phone." She smiled, her eyes sharp and assessing. "It was unusual enough that I rearranged my schedule. Jack doesn't often recommend restaurants to me." "You know Jack?" Alejandro asked, still trying to process what was happening. "We go back a long way," Claire said, a shadow passing over her features. "Before his circumstances changed. He still has an excellent palate, though, and I trust his judgment." Alejandro stood awkwardly, unsure what to do with this information or with the food blogger sitting in his empty restaurant. "Well," Claire said, opening her purse and extracting a sleek camera, "shall I try these famous arepas? And perhaps whatever else you consider your signature dishes?" For the next 2 hours, Alejandro cooked as Claire photographed, tasted, and made notes. She asked questions about his techniques, about his grandmother, about Venezuela. She seemed genuinely interested in the stories behind the food, not just the flavors themselves. "This is remarkable," she said finally, setting down her fork after tasting his pabellón criollo. "Truly, I can taste the history, the care." She glanced around the empty restaurant. "But you're struggling, aren't you?" The directness of the question caught Alejandro off guard. Pride warred with desperation in his chest. New businesses take time, he repeated his line from last night. Claire's expression softened. They do, but sometimes they need a little help to survive long enough to find their audience. She reached into her purse again, this time removing a business card. My review will be up by tonight. Should bring you some attention. Alejandro took the card, hope fluttering dangerously in his chest. Thank you. He managed, knowing that a good review might help, but not quickly enough to stop the electricity from being shut off today. As if reading his mind, Claire asked, "Is there anything immediate you need help with?" Jack seemed concerned about your situation. The final notice burned in Alejandro's pocket. His pride burned hotter. "We are managing," he said stiffly. Claire nodded, respecting his boundary. She gathered her things and stood to leave, then hesitated. Jack doesn't ask for things, you know. Not for himself. The fact that he reached out to me about your restaurant, she paused. It means something. After she left, Alejandro stood in the silent restaurant, Claire's card in one hand, the final notice in the other. He had perhaps 3 hours before the utility company came. The flutter of hope Claire had inspired began to fade. Even if her review brought customers tomorrow, it would be too late. Without electricity, there would be no tomorrow for Abuela's kitchen. His fingers found Jack's number in his wallet. Pride and desperation continued their war within him. Jack had already helped more than Alejandro could have expected, sending a food blogger his way. But Jack was homeless, surviving on the kindness of strangers himself. What more could he possibly do? With trembling fingers, Alejandro dialed the number. Jack Mercer. The voice sounded different over the phone. Clearer, somehow more substantial. "Jack, this is Alejandro." From the restaurant, "Alejandro." There was genuine warmth in Jack's voice. "Did Claire find you?" "Yes, thank you for that. She was very kind. She's good people. Her review will help." Alejandro swallowed hard. "Jack, The words caught in his throat. "What is it, son?" The gentle prompt nearly undid him. "They're shutting off my electricity today." "I can't." His voice broke. "The restaurant will be finished." Silence stretched between them, heavy with Alejandro's shame. "How much do you need?" Jack asked finally. "No, I wasn't calling to..." Alejandro started. "How much, Alejandro?" He named the amount, hating himself for each syllable. "Text me the address. I'll be there in an hour." Before Alejandro could protest further, Jack had hung up. True to his word, Jack arrived exactly 1 hour later. But he wasn't alone. A sleek black car idled at the curb, and the driver, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, accompanied Jack inside. "Alejandro, this is Diane," Jack said, his manner changed somehow. There was a straightness to his posture that hadn't been there before. "She's going to help sort out your electricity issue." Diane nodded briskly, extending her hand. "Mr. Fuentes, if I could see the notice, please?" Bewildered, Alejandro handed over the crumpled paper. Diane examined it, then made a phone call, stepping away to speak in hushed tones. "Jack, I don't understand," Alejandro said quietly. How can you..." Jack's weathered face creased into a smile that, for the first time, reached his eyes. "Let's just say appearances can be deceiving." Before Alejandro could press further, Diane returned. "It's handled," she said efficiently. "The account is current, and I've arranged for a 6-month reduced rate under the Small Business Assistance Program." "But..." "No buts," Jack interrupted gently. "Consider it an investment, not charity." After Diane excused herself to wait in the car, Jack and Alejandro stood facing each other in the empty restaurant. "Who are you?" Alejandro finally asked. Jack ran a hand through his graying beard, looking suddenly self-conscious. "That's complicated. You're not homeless." "Not exactly, no." Jack gestured to a table. "May I?" They sat, roles reversed from the night before. "I was once where you are," Jack began, his fingers tracing patterns on the tabletop. "Immigrant. New business. Struggling to make it work. For me, it was a tech startup, not a restaurant. But the fear, that bone-deep terror of failing, that's universal." He looked up, meeting Alejandro's eyes. "I succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. Built a company worth billions. Had the mansion, the cars, the trophy wife." Alejandro frowned, trying to reconcile this story with the man before him. The worn clothes, the weathered face, the humble demeanor. What happened?" "I lost myself," Jack said simply. "Became someone I didn't recognize. Someone my parents, who'd sacrificed everything to bring me to this country, would have been ashamed of." His gaze drifted to the window, watching snowflakes begin to fall. 3 years ago, I walked away, signed most of my assets over to charitable foundations, kept enough to live on comfortably, but not extravagantly. And I started walking, living simply, remembering what it's like to be human, not just successful. But Alejandro gestured vaguely. Jack smiled ruefully. Part experiment, part penance, part way to see the world honestly again. When you appear homeless, you become invisible to most people. You see the true nature of society, who stops to help, who looks away. He leaned forward. You fed me, Alejandro. Not leftovers, not scraps. A meal you prepared with care that you shared as an equal. Do you know how rare that is? Alejandro didn't know what to say. The revelation was too much to process at once. I don't want your charity, he finally managed, pride reasserting itself. Good, Jack said firmly, because I'm not offering it. I'm offering partnership, investment. I have money to spare and knowledge about building successful businesses. You have talent, dedication, and the best arepas I've tasted outside of Caracas. He extended his hand across the table. What do you say? Partners? Alejandro stared at the offered hand. Why? Why help me? Jack's expression grew serious. Because 20 years ago, someone helped me when I was exactly where you are now. They saw potential when all I could see was failure. They invested not just money but belief. His eyes grew distant with memory. I promised myself I'd do the same one day. Pay it forward. The restaurant door opened, letting in a swirl of snowflakes and a young couple stamping their feet against the cold. Are you open? The woman called, unwinding her scarf. We read about this place on Boston Bites just now. The review went live about 20 minutes ago. Jack smiled, withdrawing his hand. Think about my offer. For now, you have customers to serve. The next 3 hours passed in a blur as Claire's review brought a steady stream of curious diners to Abuela's kitchen. Alejandro cooked while Jack, without being asked, stepped smoothly into the role of host and server. His earlier scruffiness somehow transformed into an air of distinguished casualness. Together, they managed the unexpected lunch rush, moving around each other as if they'd worked together for years rather than hours. When there was finally a lull, Alejandro emerged from the kitchen to find Jack charming the last table of customers. You're a natural, Alejandro said when Jack joined him at the counter. Jack shrugged. I've worn many hats in my life. This one fits better than most. Alejandro took a deep breath. Your offer. Partnership. What exactly would that look like? Jack's eyes lit up. Whatever we decide together. I can provide capital, business expertise, connections. You provide the heart and soul, the food, the vision. And what do you get out of it? Purpose. Jack answered without hesitation. A connection. And really good arepas whenever I want them. For the first time that day, perhaps the first time in months, Alejandro laughed, the sound startling in its genuineness. My grandmother would say you were an angel sent to test my character, he said, shaking his head in wonder. And did you pass? Alejandro thought about it, about sharing his meal, about swallowing his pride to ask for help. I think she would say we both did. They shook hands across the counter, snow falling softly outside the windows. The empty restaurant no longer feeling like failure, but like possibility. Over the following weeks, Abuela's kitchen transformed. Jack's investment allowed for modest renovations. Nothing flashy, but improvements that made the space warmer, more inviting. His business acumen helped Alejandro price his menu more strategically, develop relationships with local suppliers, and implement systems that made operations smoother. But most importantly, Jack brought people, not just customers, though those increased steadily after Claire's glowing review, but connections, food critics, local business leaders, social media influencers who specializing in discovering authentic hidden gems. Jack himself became a fixture in the restaurant, sometimes greeting customers in his now cleaned up but still casual attire, sometimes working alongside Alejandro in the kitchen. His presence was both calming and energizing, his belief in Alejandro's food unshakable. You need to tell me your story, Alejandro said one night as they sat in the empty restaurant after closing, sharing a bottle of Venezuelan rum. The real one. Jack swirled the amber liquid in his glass. What makes you think I haven't? Because you're still keeping secrets. I see it in your eyes sometimes. Jack smiled faintly. Perceptive. He took a slow sip of rum. What do you want to know? Everything. Who you really are. Why you were pretending to be homeless. Why me? Why this restaurant? Jack set his glass down carefully. My real name is Jackson Mercer. Does that mean anything to you? Alejandro shook his head. Good. That's... Good. Jack seemed relieved. I founded Tech Vault Securities, built it from nothing into one of the largest cybersecurity firms in the country. Alejandro's eyes widened slightly. Even he, with his limited knowledge of American business, had heard of Tech Vault. 3 years ago, my wife left me. Not that our marriage had been anything but a business arrangement for years. My daughter stopped speaking to me after I missed her college graduation for a merger negotiation. And my doctor told me I had developed hypertension and needed to reduce stress. Jack's laugh was hollow, as if the stress was something separate from me, not the very air I breathed. He looked down at his hands. Strong, weathered, no longer bearing the soft signs of wealth. I realized I had succeeded at everything except being human. So I stepped down as CEO, keeping only a position on the board. I sold most of my shares, donated billions to various foundations, and kept just enough to live comfortably. And then started pretending to be homeless? Alejandro asked, still confused by this part. Jack shook his head. Not at first. First, I tried conventional philanthropy, writing checks, attending galas, sitting on boards. But it felt distant, sterile. I was still in a bubble of privilege, trying to solve problems I didn't truly understand. He leaned forward, eyes intense. So I started an experiment. 1 week living on the streets. No credit cards, no phone, no safety net. Just to understand. 1 week became 2 years on and off. Jack finished. Not continuously. I have an apartment. I check in with my foundation, with my daughter who's finally speaking to me again. But I spend about half my time as you first met me. Just walking, observing, being present in the world without the shield of wealth. He smiled, a genuine expression that softened his weathered features. I've learned more in these 2 years than in 2 decades of running Tech Vault. About people, about society, about myself. And where do I fit in? Alejandro asked quietly. Jack's expression grew serious. When I was 24, fresh off the boat from Ireland, I was trying to start my first company. Everything was failing. I was down to my last $100, sleeping in a storage unit, coding day and night. His fingers traced the rim of his glass. A restaurant owner, an older Italian immigrant named Marco, fed me for free for nearly 6 months. He said my determination reminded him of himself when he was young. When I finally got my first contract, he refused repayment, said to help someone else instead when I could. Jack looked up, meeting Alejandro's gaze. You remind me of him, the care you put into your food. The way you fed me that night without hesitation, even when you were drowning yourself. So this is you repaying an old debt? Alejandro wasn't sure how to feel about that. No, Jack said firmly. This is me recognizing genuine talent and determination worth investing in. The parallel to Marco just made me pay attention where I might otherwise have walked past. He refilled their glasses. I've helped 8 other small businesses in the past 2 years. Some succeed, some fail. I offer what I can, but ultimately it's their journey. And how many of those were restaurants owned by immigrants? Alejandro asked, a smile tugging at his lips. Jack laughed. You're the third, actually. What can I say? I have a soft spot for good food and immigrant grit. The restaurant continued to flourish through winter into spring. Alejandro expanded the menu, hired 2 part-time staff, and even began catering small events. Jack's involvement remained consistent but unobtrusive. He was there when needed, absent when not, always respectful of the fact that this was, ultimately, Alejandro's dream. In April, when the restaurant had been steadily profitable for 2 months, Alejandro arrived early one morning to find an envelope on the counter. Inside was a set of keys and a note in Jack's handwriting. For the apartment above the restaurant. It's yours now. I bought the building. Consider it a proper investment in my business partner, rather than your continuing to sleep on that awful cot. Your grandmother would haunt me if I let her grandson break his back while building her legacy. Tramonye. Alejandro stood frozen, keys in hand. The apartment above the restaurant, a space he'd looked at longingly but could never afford, now his. The implications slowly sank in. No more cot in the storage room. A real home right above his business. When Jack arrived that afternoon, Alejandro was waiting. You can't just buy buildings and give away apartments, he said without preamble. Jack raised an eyebrow. I believe I just did. It's too much. It's a sound business investment. Jack countered calmly. Property in this neighborhood is appreciating. Having the restaurant owner live on site reduces security concerns. And keeping you from developing chronic back problems saves on potential healthcare costs. Alejandro shook his head, torn between gratitude and discomfort. This goes beyond partnership. Jack's expression softened. Does it? In my culture, my original one, not the cutthroat business world I inhabited for too long, taking care of people isn't charity. It's community. He placed a hand on Alejandro's shoulder. Let me do this. Not as Jack Mercer the billionaire, but as Jack your friend. The simple word friend caught Alejandro off guard. When had that happened? This unlikely connection between a Venezuelan immigrant and an Irish-American former tech mogul had somehow, without either of them noticing, deepened into genuine friendship. My grandmother would have liked you, Alejandro said, finally accepting the keys. Jack's smile was brilliant. Highest compliment you could give me. Summer brought new opportunities. Jack suggested they convert the small alley beside the restaurant into outdoor seating, complete with string lights and potted herbs. The space quickly became one of the most sought-after dining spots in the neighborhood, the waiting list growing longer each weekend. Alejandro, who had once been too nervous to leave the kitchen, now occasionally emerged to greet customers, gaining confidence as he saw their genuine enjoyment of his food. The recipes his grandmother had whispered to him had become a bridge, not just to his past, but to his future in this new country. One evening in late August, as they sat in the alley after closing, enjoying the warm breeze and the last of the season's fresh lemonade, Jack seemed unusually contemplative. I have to go away for a while, he said finally. Alejandro set down his glass. Berriture business? Family. My daughter's getting married in October. I'll be gone for about a month, helping with preparations, then the wedding, then spending some time with her afterward. Jack looked uncharacteristically nervous. Will you be okay running things without me? Alejandro laughed. Jack, I run things every day. You just show up to charm the customers and steal food from the kitchen. Jack clutched his chest in mock offense. I test the food. Quality control is essential to our business model. Go, Alejandro said, smiling. Be with your daughter. The restaurant will be fine. Jack nodded, relief evident in his expression. I've never been much of a father, he admitted quietly. Always too busy building the empire, missing the moments that mattered. She's giving me another chance I don't deserve. Second chances are precious, Alejandro said, thinking of his own journey, how close he'd come to losing everything before Jack appeared. Don't waste it. I won't. Jack raised his glass. To second chances and the people who grant them. They clinked glasses under the string lights, fireflies dancing around them like earthbound stars. Jack left in September, promising to call regularly. At first he did, checking in every few days, asking about sales, about new recipes Alejandro was developing, about the staff. But as the wedding approached, the calls became less frequent, shorter, distracted. Alejandro didn't mind. The restaurant was thriving, and he had grown increasingly confident in his business decisions. Jack deserved this time with his daughter, unburdened by worries about Abuela's kitchen. Then came the letter from Immigration. Alejandro stared at the official envelope. His visa application for renewal had been flagged for additional review. His hands trembled as he read the bureaucratic language, trying to decipher what it meant. The only clear thing was the interview date, 3 weeks away, and the list of additional documentation required. He needed to prove the business was viable. He needed tax records, profit statements, proof of consistent income. He needed Jack's partnership agreement, properly filed and documented. The partnership agreement they'd sealed with a handshake, but never formalized on paper. Alejandro tried calling Jack, straight to voicemail. He tried again the next day, and the next, nothing. Doubt began to creep in. Had Jack tired of his charity project? Had the novelty of helping a struggling immigrant worn off once the business found its footing? Or had he simply become reabsorbed into his real life, the world of wealth and privilege he'd temporarily stepped away from? The questions plagued Alejandro as he continued running the restaurant, smiling for customers while anxiety gnawed at his insides. Without proper documentation of Jack's investment and partnership, his visa renewal was in jeopardy. Without the visa, everything they'd built together would be lost. 2 weeks before the immigration interview, with still no word from Jack, Alejandro made a desperate decision. Using the business phone's caller ID, he found the number Jack had called from in recent months. Not the flip phone he'd initially given Alejandro, but presumably his real number. A woman answered. Monsieur, Mercer's office. Alejandro froze. Office? I need to speak with Jack Mercer, please. It's urgent. Mr. Mercer is unavailable. May I take a message? Her tone was polite but distant. This is Alejandro Fuentes. I'm his business partner. It's regarding an immigration matter that can't wait. A pause. 1 moment, please. The hold music that followed was jarringly cheerful against Alejandro's mounting anxiety. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the line clicked. "Mr. Fuentes?" A different woman's voice, brisk and efficient. "This is Diane. We met briefly when Jack first became involved with your restaurant." "Yes, I remember. Jack is currently in California with limited phone access due to the remote location of his daughter's wedding. However, he did leave contingency instructions regarding your business." Her tone softened slightly. "I understand you have an immigration interview." "Yes, in 2 weeks. I need documentation of our partnership agreement, but we never—" He stopped, embarrassed to admit they'd never properly formalized things. "I'm aware of the situation," Diane said, and Alejandro could hear papers rustling. Jack anticipated this might happen. He had partnership papers drawn up months ago, but was waiting to discuss some of the terms with you in person. Relief flooded through Alejandro so intensely he had to grip the counter for support. "He did. Of course. Jack doesn't do anything halfway, Mr. Fuentes. The papers just need your signature. I can have them delivered tomorrow, along with all the supporting financial documentation you'll need for your interview." "Thank you," Alejandro whispered, emotion making his voice rough. "Please tell Jack. Tell him thank you. I'll pass along the message when I can reach him. And Mr. Fuentes, Jack believes in you. Remember that." The immigration interview went smoothly with the documentation Diane had provided. Partnership papers showing Jack's 40% investment in the business, tax records, profit statements, even letters from satisfied customers, and positive reviews from food critics. When the interviewer asked about his business partner's absence, Alejandro explained about the wedding, showing the formal letter Jack had apparently instructed his lawyers to prepare, stating his commitment to the business and endorsing Alejandro's visa application. By the time he left the immigration office, visa renewal provisionally approved pending final processing, Alejandro felt lightheaded with relief. The restaurant, his future in America, was secure. That evening, he closed early and sat alone in the alley garden, nursing a glass of rum and trying to process the emotional whiplash of the past weeks. The doubt he had allowed to grow about Jack's commitment now filled him with shame. How could he have questioned the man who had saved not just his business, but his dream? His phone rang, an unfamiliar number. "Alejandro." "It's Jack." The connection was poor, his voice breaking up slightly. "Diane told me about the immigration situation. I'm so sorry I wasn't there." "It's okay," Alejandro said quickly. "Everything worked out. The documentation you had prepared was perfect. I should have done it months ago." Jack sounded genuinely distressed. "I didn't think—" "Jack," Alejandro interrupted. "You've done more for me than anyone in my life except my grandmother. Don't apologize for being with your daughter during her wedding." A long pause filled with static. "The ceremony was yesterday," Jack said finally. "It was beautiful. She looked—" "God, Alejandro, I never thought I'd see this day. That she'd want me here." The raw emotion in Jack's voice struck Alejandro deeply. This man who had appeared in his life as a beggar, revealed himself as a benefactor, and become a friend was now sharing his most vulnerable moment. His reconciliation with his daughter, his second chance at being a father. "I'm happy for you, my friend," Alejandro said softly. "I'll be back next week," Jack said, his voice steadier now. "We should talk about expanding the menu, and maybe looking at a second location next year." Alejandro laughed. "One thing at a time. That's not how I built an empire," Jack retorted, humor returning to his voice. "No, but it's how we'll build this one," Alejandro said firmly. "It together." Jack returned from California changed. Subtle differences Alejandro noticed immediately. There was a lightness to him, a peace that hadn't been there before. He spoke of his daughter often now, showing pictures of the wedding, making plans for her and her husband to visit the restaurant. "She wants to meet you," Jack said one evening as they reviewed the books together. "Says you must be either a saint or insane to put up with me as a business partner." Alejandro grinned. "Can I be both?" As fall deepened into winter again, marking a full year since their first encounter, Abuela's Kitchen had become one of Boston's most beloved restaurants. Still small, still intimate, but now with lines forming before opening and reservations booked weeks in advance. The anniversary called for celebration. Jack insisted on closing the restaurant for a private party, inviting everyone who had been part of their journey. Claire from Boston Bites, Diane, the part-time staff who had become like family, even the landlord who had initially warned Alejandro about encouraging the homeless. As Alejandro moved through the crowded restaurant, accepting congratulations and serving his grandmother's recipes to the people who had helped make her dream live on, he caught sight of Jack standing quietly in a corner, watching the proceedings with evident satisfaction. Alejandro made his way to his partner's side. "Hiding from your own party?" Jack shrugged. "Just observing. You've built something remarkable here, Alejandro." "We built it," Alejandro corrected. Jack shook his head. "I provided resources. You provided the heart." He gestured around at the vibrant scene. People laughing, eating, connecting. "This is you. All of it." "Not all," Alejandro insisted. "A year ago today, I was about to lose everything. You changed that." Jack's expression grew thoughtful. "Did I ever tell you why I stopped at your restaurant that night? Of all the places in Boston, why yours?" Alejandro shook his head. "The name, Abuela's Kitchen. My grandmother helped raise me after my parents brought us from Ireland. She couldn't afford much, but she always made sure I had a home-cooked meal. When I saw your restaurant's name," Jack's voice grew rough with emotion. "It felt like a sign. From one grandmother to another." Alejandro murmured. "Exactly." Jack raised his glass. "To our grandmothers, who taught us what really matters." They clinked glasses as the party continued around them, the restaurant warm with light and laughter on a cold December night. Later, after the guests had left and they were cleaning up together, a routine neither had ever abandoned despite being able to afford staff to do it, Alejandro found himself thinking about the journey of the past year. "I had it all wrong," he said suddenly. Jack looked up from wiping down a table. "What? What's that?" "That first night, when I thought I was helping you by sharing my meal." Alejandro shook his head, smiling. "I thought I was the one giving, but you were always the one with more to offer." Jack straightened, his expression serious. "That's not true. You offered dignity when you thought I had nothing. You offered friendship without agenda. Those things," his voice caught, "those things are worth more than all the money I ever made." "Maybe we saved each other," Alejandro suggested quietly. Jack considered this, then nodded slowly. "Maybe we did." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the city in white, covering the old, making way for the new, just as their unlikely friendship had done for them both. The immigrant had shared a meal with a beggar, stunned when the beggar later saved his business. But the greater miracle was this. In saving each other, they had both found something neither wealth nor security could provide: a sense of belonging, of purpose, of family forged through kindness rather than blood. And as they stood together in the warm light of Abuela's kitchen, watching the snow transform the world outside, both men knew with absolute certainty that their grandmothers would be proud.